Thank you all for being here. I'm glad to be here too. So I'm going to be talking about translation. Translation is a huge topic that people can come at from lots of different angles. I imagine this is quite a multilingual and transnational kind of audience, is it? I mean, Google is obviously a hugely international company. So translation and communication between languages, I guess, is something that is important in your organization and your working lives. I'm going to try and mainly talk about things that are different from that. What I'm going to do is say a little bit about, a bit more about who I am and where I'm coming from. So my interest in how I got interested in the field of translation. Then I'm going to look at various different instances of practices of moving between languages which can get called translation, because I think one of the things to see in thinking about translation is that there are lots of different kinds of thing that can get called translation. So what we're really dealing with here is an umbrella word with lots of different ways of doing things that are different in important ways that nevertheless all get called translation. Then I'm going to try to think a bit about the relationship between translation and languages, because if you've got translation, then you have to have languages, but what is a language anyway? And how does the practice that we call, or the range of practices that we call translation, relate to the kind of range of phenomena that we call languages? And then I'm going to ask how things might be changing now, and I hope you'll be able to help me with that, because obviously the internet and what Google does is a huge part of how the whole landscape of communication is changing at the moment. So why is this interesting to me? So I'm a literary person. I write novels, as Jan said, and I also write literary historical books. So when I was a kid, I was interested in just in reading, and then I did the very typical thing that happens in the UK, which is it's not really a monolingual culture, but there are large stretches of UK culture which are predominantly monolingual. So I did the thing that's very typical for a kid in the UK who likes reading. I went to university and I found myself studying a subject called English, without having really realized that that was what was going to happen. So when I was a teenager, I liked reading books from lots of different places, and it didn't really matter to me whether they were in translation or not. And I found myself in a university structure that was set up this happened to be in Cambridge, but it could have been in many other universities. An institutional structure that was set up early in the 20th century when the idea of Englishness and creating an English national identity was really important. And so the notion, the attachment, the idea that what you should read is kind of English books was quite a sort of dominant idea there, as it also is in the university where I teach now, which is Oxford. But what I found myself getting interested in was writers who weren't really very English at all. So I found myself getting interested particularly in some writers from the mid-19th century, for instance, Robert Browning. I don't know if you know any of his poems, but he's a writer. He very much likes setting his poems in foreign countries, especially Italy, and setting them in the past, and creating a setup in which you have to imagine that the person speaking the poem is speaking quite a different language, is speaking the sort of Italian that Italians spoke in the 16th century. And yet the words on the page are English words. And so there's this sort of silent, implicit translation that's part of what's going on in the poem. And indeed, another thing about what Browning does is that he writes, like many poets, many literary writers, he uses language in strange and surprising ways. And part of how he came to do this, it struck me, is that he's very interested in taking ways of using language from other languages and trying to bring them into English. So, for instance, there's a poem from 1855 called An Epistle Containing the Strange Medical Experience of Karshish, the Arab Physician. Browning doesn't know Arabic, but he's got a sense of what Arabic is like, and he tries to write his English in such a way that it has a kind of strangeness about it. So, for instance, there'll be lines, the speaker will say things like, instead of saying, I arrived at Jericho, the speaker will say, my journeyings were brought to Jericho. And what I got interested in was, and that's quite, as a piece of literary writing, that's a strange and interesting line, but it's come to be like that through translation. And so what I was noticing increasingly in the stuff I was reading and getting interested in was an overlap between translation and literary creativity. When you look at a literary text, you want it to do something new in language, and quite often, actually, surprisingly often, new stylistic things were being done in language through either actual translation or sort of being aware of what another language would be like. So I had that, but then I also had this in my mind, this sort of cliche that there is around in the culture that translations are never as good as the original, literature always loses something in translation, poetry is what is lost in translation, as the American poet Robert Frost is reported as having said. I thought at Google of all places we wouldn't have this kind of problem with the AV, but hey, it's nice to know. Anyway, yeah, so that was one thing. Then the other thing is that when I started writing fiction, so I grew up in a completely monolingual, standard English-speaking household in London. But my parents were scientists, and so they spoke actually a language that was quite strange to me. Lots of scientific words that I didn't understand when I was a kid, and I still don't, really understand. And I found that when I started writing fiction, I was interested in using kinds of English that weren't universally comprehensible, or at least are a bit peculiar. So my first novel is in the voice of an interior designer who uses lots of interior design jargon, and I was interested in the sort of distinctiveness of that voice. And my second novel has got because my family are doctors, my second novel is very much in the mind of a doctor. And I was interested in that special language that doctors know that allows them to describe the world and understand things about people that, people who just speak ordinary English like me can't do. So I kind of frantically mugged up on lots of medical terminology in order to create this character. So what I realized I was working with there was the feeling that English isn't just a language, English is a whole range of different ways of using the language. And actually, to move, everybody encounters kinds of language use that count as one's own language, a kind of language use that counts as English that I don't understand. And that's an experience that happens the whole time. It happens when I'm talking to my kids, it happens when I'm talking to someone who knows a technical language that I don't know. So I got interested in how translation can also happen within the things that we think of as being languages, not just between them. But alongside that, there's seems to me quite a loose way of thinking that says, well, everything is translation, really. All communication is translation. You find people, I don't know if you've come across this, but this is a sort of phrase that floats around. And I don't like that phrase because as soon as you expand a word enormously like that, expand it metaphorically like that, it loses all meaning. But I found that I was interested in, I was nevertheless, though, I was interested in the idea that translation can happen within a language as well as between it. So those really are the two sort of overarching questions that I bring with me to the topic. One is, everyone thinks that poetry is lost in translation, and yet my experience is that you can create poetry through translation. The other one is, I don't really like the phrase, all communication is translation, because I feel it's meaningless. Nevertheless, I'm really interested in the idea that translation happens within a language, between different kinds of the same language, as well as between different languages. Okay, so what I'm going to, so that's sort of, that's kind of where I'm coming from. Now, what I want to do now, I've had a little drink, is just look at some instances of things that, as it were, scenes of translation from different moments and different cultural places and different moments in history, just to get a sense of the variety of the field, as it were. So the first one is the school classroom, and this is where I learnt my languages, and maybe this is a kind of familiar environment to many of you. So you're in a classroom, or you're in an exam hall, as here. There's a passage of a foreign language on the whiteboard, or on the blackboard, or on the text, and you have to translate it. And your translation is going to be marked by the teacher or the examiner. So you're going to get ticks and crosses, and you'll get a mark as a result of that. So what's happening in this instance of translation, or this scene of translation, is firstly, it's subject to discipline. And I think as soon as you're using the word translation, questions of right and wrong, or better and worse, kind of come into the room as well. So the idea of translation and the idea of discipline kind of belong together. The other general point I want to bring from this particular context is that the kind of translation that school kids or students do in order to show that they know the language is a particular kind of thing. So the teacher is marking it, and the teacher is saying, can I tell from this translation that the student has understood the text in the original language well enough? And so in that environment, you're doing something that's called translation. But what's controlling what you actually do is the need to show the teacher that you understood the foreign language. And that means that lots of kind of freedom that, say, literary translators of novels, a translator who's just somebody speaking and somebody else is speaking to interpret orally, the kinds of thing that in those circumstances you're able to do, in a school or university setting you're not able to do because you're subject to this discipline of showing that you've understood this grammatical form and this phrase and this idiom and so on. And that's why the kinds of translations that get done in school context or get done in academic context often, read in quite a stilted way because they're not being designed to be read, they're being designed for this particular academic exercise. So the general points I want to get from that are that translation is never just into a language. It's being done in a particular context, subject to a set of particular expectations for a particular purpose. And those are always things, when you're thinking about what's going on in any instance of translation, those are always things that are going to, that you need to bear in mind. I want briefly to contrast this with a much kind of freer, oral kind of multilingual kind of context moving across languages. So say you've got a group of, as I guess happens in this building quite a lot, say you've got a group of people speaking, they all know different languages, you want to communicate, you want to find a shared medium of communication. Maybe English is the shared language, but the people speaking are coming from different languages into English, speaking English, all speaking English in slightly different ways. And you sort of negotiate a medium of understanding, don't you? So say there's an Italian speaker, and the Italian speaker might say to the English speaker, in bocca al lupo. In bocca al lupo is an Italian way of saying good luck. Literally it means in the mouth of the wolf. The English speaker might not understand. The Italian speaker might explain. The French speaker might say, bonne chance or something. And you'd have a kind of, on the one hand, a kind of coming to understand, but on the other hand, a sort of freer area of language mixing, which is quite different from the classroom setting. So that's showing how what happens across languages can be quite different in a different setting. The other thing it's showing, which I'm not sure how much I'm going to talk about, but maybe we can talk about in discussion at the end. We'll talk about it in discussion at the end, is the real importance of the difference between spoken language and how people behave with their voices and written language and how people move across languages when they're dealing with writing or on a screen. And actually the internet is obviously blurring that distinction to some extent. But I'm just going to leave that there for the moment and come back to it. Now my next example is from back in the 16th century. And who we have here is the Sultan, the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, Sultan Murad III, and we have Queen Elizabeth I of England. And they're writing letters to each other, or they're in diplomatic communication. And the way that works is that no one really in the Turkish court understands English, and no one really in the English court understands Turkish. So they use Italian as an intermediary language. And obviously both these rulers are tremendously proud, and each one has a very vivid sense of her own importance or his own importance. But they need to negotiate in the way they communicate to one another in such a way as to not spark a conflict or not fall out too much. And so the person who's charged with this is the translator, the person who's charged not only with putting the meaning across from one person to another, but also sustaining a peaceful channel of communication is a translator. And the Turkish word for this kind of translator is dragoman. And there's a lovely bit in one of their in one of their letters where the Sultan writes, Elizabeth has written a letter to Sultan Murad III. And he writes back saying, thank you, monarch, for demonstrating your subservience and devotion to me. And I've got the my Turkish is not very good, but izai ubidiyet ve ilas, and I can't speak Turkish, but those are the Turkish words. And the dragoman looks at that and thinks, Elizabeth I is not really going to be very pleased to see that he thinks that she is subservient to him. So when he translates that into Italian, he says, he changes it to thank you for showing sincera amicizia, thank you for showing sincere friendship towards me. And when she receives the letter, that's what she understands, and the same thing happens the other way. And you're going to think how sweet and how, how unusual, but actually, so what we have here is an instance of translation and diplomacy going together. And the point I want to draw from this is that translation is also always a matter of doing something that's going to be acceptable in the community that you're moving the text into. So when you're wondering, okay, here's this thing in this other language, I'm writing it in this language, I'm going to translate it into this language, but I need it to be readable, I need people to accept it. I need people, I need to put it into language in a way that is going to be acceptable in the community I'm putting it into language for.